Hello, hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in the last episode, I gave a brief overview of a history of white tea production in China with a huge focus on northern Fujian, chiefly in Fuding. In this episode, I want to break up Fuding into all the different villages or the gens, the counties that are famous for making teas in the past and in the present, and give you a little more geographical understanding of this entire region. I want to get into the culture, I want to get into the language, I want to get into my stories about the people I've met from this region, who are living in this region, who are making tea in this region. And essentially, I have somebody picked out from all of the different villages that are responsible for making white tea in Fuding. And I want to just talk about their stories and how I can see these different regions through them and the teas they make and kind of their views on the tea market as well. But let's back up a little bit, because last episode, I talked a lot about many different regions in China. I mentioned Wenzhou, I mentioned Wuyi, the Wuyi Mountains, I mentioned Ningbo, southern Zhejiang, I mentioned the ocean, I mentioned Fujian, and of course northern Fuding. And these are all places where, unless you've spent some time looking at a map or living in China, a lot of them might just be names to you. And maybe you don't know exactly where Wuyishan is, but you know it's in Fujian, but then maybe you don't really understand where Fujian is. And so what I want to do is just totally back up and give you a full overview of the geographic layout of this area. So to give you this mental map, if you look at a map of China and you find Shanghai is about midway between Guangzhou and Beijing, right on the coast. And if you follow from Shanghai down the coast about 600 kilometers, you'll hit Fuding. And coming from another direction, if you look at Taiwan and northern Taiwan, Taipei, and you go across that strait, perpendicular, you essentially hit Fuzhou. And then Fuzhou is the capital of Fujian. You go along the coast up north about 100 kilometers and you hit Fuding. And Fuding itself is this tiny city that a lot of people in China don't even really know about. When I tell people I travel there for tea, a lot of people ask me where it is. They ask me to repeat it several times, and I write it down, and then they see it, and they're like, oh, yeah, I think I've heard of that before. And so it's not a household name. It's not like saying I'm going to Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou or even Hangzhou or something like that. It's a small city where if you don't care about tea, if you don't care about white tea, there's no reason for you to know about this city. Unfortunately, because it's a beautiful place. And so there are two facts about this that might seem surprising to a lot of people, is that one, not everyone in China drinks tea. And this is true because it's really a part of the older generation. A lot of the youth are more into coffee, they're more into bubble teas and milk teas, and really the people that are drinking teas every day, day in, day out, are the grandparents in the older generation. And thus it has this feeling of something that's not really hip, I guess. I think like coffee is cool in China the same way tea is cool in the West, because it's something that's new and novel and has all this equipment and this science to it and a big culture that exists elsewhere. And then you're trying to build that culture domestically. And so it's really interesting to see that kind of trade-off here. But again, a lot of the young people I talk to, they've never really thought about white tea. And they've never thought, oh, Fuding has the best white tea, or Fuding is the birthplace of white tea. And they've never thought of Fuding. When I talk about Fuzhou or Fujian, they talk about shaman, they talk about the food and stuff like that, but tea is not on their minds. The second reason that a lot of people don't know about tea in Fuding is that it really didn't catch on domestically until the early 2000s. 2007 is the date that keeps coming around, because that's the date in the research, that's the date this new marketing slogan was coined and whatnot, the 1 year tea, 3 years medicine, 7 years treasure. And so a lot of people don't really know about Fuding, especially in China. And to me, that makes it all the more intriguing because it's difficult to reach. Not a lot of people are going there, and it's retaining its kind of very specific purpose, which is, making incredibly high quality white teas. And the Fuding government has latched onto it with every ounce of force and power it has to, and I'll talk about, I keep hinting at this, but I'll talk about it in another episode. All the legislations and the laws and the reforms about growing and making and selling white tea in Fuding, it's very strict because what we see in the south of Fujian and Anxi has really just destroyed that area for tea production, and the quality of Anxi has just totally been deteriorating over the years, but I digress. I like Fuding because not a lot of people know about it, because it is difficult to get to, and there are no, from where I live and for every place I have lived in China, there's no direct trains there, no direct flights there. What I have to do is I've gotten there two ways. One is from the north, one is from the south. And so one is coming through Wenzhou, which I mentioned before in the last episode, where Lu Yu quotes the Wenzhou area, 300 li east of the Wenzhou area, they make tea. We've talked about maybe that's 300 miles south, which would be Taimushan. I was looking on the map, and li and kilometers are a little different. Li is the ancient Chinese measurement, and kilometers are the modern day measurement, if you didn't know that. And about 100 kilometers south of Wenzhou is Fuding. And so what I usually have to do is I have to transfer through Wenzhou on a train and then come south along the coast to Fuding. Otherwise, I have to fly into Fuzhou and then take a train north. And I really like this one as well because, again, as I mentioned, the geographical location of this, it's right on the coast, and you have all these estuaries and all these like reefy areas where they're fishing and they're growing and they're farming fish and stuff. And so you see so much work going on in the ocean, and the trains just cut right over all of that. So you're half in land, half in sea most of the trip. And it's really just beautiful because you have the coastal mountains if you're coming up from Fuzhou on your left, and you have the ocean on your right, and then sometimes they kind of blend and mix. And anyways, it's really, really wonderful. And as I mentioned in the last episode, and I'll mention it later, this area was famous during the Qing Dynasty, during the Opium Wars, for having secret coves and secret harbors and different places where you could smuggle out products to trade with the foreigners, to trade with the Westerners and whatnot, because China had the embargo going on against all trade. Speaking briefly about the climate, it's a subtropical monsoon climate, so you get a lot of rain, you get a lot of growth, a lot of vegetation. Things tend to go really well here, and this is right in that tea belt. We have the Wuyi Mountains, we have Zhonghe that makes their own white tea, we have Hangzhou not far away, Bilochun a little further north, we have Anxi to the south, we have the Wuyi Mountain oolongs, the Dansong oolongs, all right within this Fujian area. And so it's kind of the golden place for tea. And also what's cool about Fuding is this is where all the rivers meet the ocean. And back in the past, so much trade was done by boat. It's really difficult to imagine. So rivers are essentially the highways of ancient China. And so if you're not close to a river, maybe your tea won't take off. Maybe your village won't do so well. And so everything's built along these ideas of fast travel and transportation and selling goods and trading goods. And so all of this conspires to make Fuding a very nice location in ancient times and then also still modern times. If you're looking at Fuding from the ground, it's very mountainous, and yet the mountains aren't very tall. What you see is the coastal mountain ranges, maybe the maximum height is about 1,000 meters. A lot of it's between 300 and 600. And so when you're looking at these terms, especially regarding Fuding white tea and white tea, high mountain is a very relative term, where maybe it's above 600 meters. A lot of the mountains in Panxi are between 300 meters and 500 meters, and so technically you're never going to get anything that's truly Gaoshan or high mountain, but it is relatively high in relation to the rest of Fuding. So talking a bit about Fuding, First impressions when you get there, it's just a small city. There's a small, not even a real big city, like no skyscrapers, a lot of apartment buildings, a few malls, but really nothing that impressive. But then also, there aren't any tea fields right there. And so, what you have to do is you have to get outside of the Fuding city limits and into the smaller towns and townships nearby. And as I mentioned, there are a few main towns that I've been to that produce great quality white tea. So, starting with the closest tea village to Fuding City, that's Diantou. Diantou is about 30 kilometers south, and as I mentioned before, more of a wholesale hub than an actual tea village. Just southwest of Diantou, we get Bailing. Bailing is kind of a middle grounds between the old tea production we saw in Diantou and the new tea production we're seeing in Panxi, because just 10 kilometers further south, you get my favorite place, Panxi, which is the poster child for new Fuding White Tea. And about a dozen or so kilometers south of that, you get Taimushan. Another region I want to mention for its sheer volume of tea output is Guangling, which is about 40 kilometers north of the Fuding area, as far as like the Fuding train station goes. And Guangling is right on the border between Fujian and Zhejiang. So, to recap, the main production villages I want to talk about in Fuding: Diantou, Bailing, Panxi, Taimushan, and Guangling. So, if you're paying attention from the last episode, with regards to production regions, places that are making tea within Fuding, you've probably heard of two. The first one, which I mentioned a whole lot in the last episode, is Taimushan, the mythic birthplace of white tea. This is the mountain where the old lady was healing people in prehistory at the base of it with tea, and eventually they renamed the mountain after her grandmother mountain, Taimushan. This is a place that has its origin in ancient history. It claims to be the place where they were growing the Ming Dynasty, the Lu Shuiya, the green snowbud. And this is where I mentioned I went to last episode, and I'll kind of talk about it again here in a second. But the other place that we've heard of, if you're listening to the end, is Diantou. Diantou is that kind of smuggling hub in the Qing Dynasty for white tea getting out of China. And what's interesting about this is we have the ancient place where they were making white tea from prehistory, and then that's Taimushan. Then we have Diantou, which is where they were making it in the Qing Dynasty when it was really rising in popularity. But the question is, where are they making tea now? And the short answer to this, before I get into the details, is that everybody in Fuding wants a garden in Panxi. Panxi right now is as I mentioned, the poster child for all the new tea that's being made in Fuding. Because of the nature of the land, the tea that's coming out of there is just fantastic. And so a lot of people say they have a garden from Panxi, even if they don't, even if it's from Bailing. Bailing, like I said, is in between Panxi and Diantou. And so we see a lot of modern tea production in Panxi and Bailing. And the other place that's really popular right now for Fuding white tea is Guangling, which is up north, right on the border between Fujian and Zhejiang. And I will go into this in depth later. I think actually I might have to break this episode up into a few different episodes where I cover a different region in each one, because like I said, I want to follow the person I met, the tea fields I found, the villages I went to, and it takes a lot of time, I guess, now that I'm actually getting into it. So, backing up, let's talk about getting into Fuding and getting out into the tea mountains, and essentially my first step. In this episode, I'll kind of fix it probably to Diantou and Panxi. So let's talk about how to get from Fuding out into these tea mountains. And in order to do this, what I'll do is I'll just tell you about my first experience in Fuding, the problems I had, and how I got out to the tea mountains. So it all comes from getting off of the train in Fuding. And something about the train station is it's still like 5, 6, 7, 8 kilometers south of the actual city. And again, I'm using the city in a very loose term because it's a pretty small place. And so what you have to do is you have to get a cab immediately. And when I was there the first time, all the cabs were essentially unionized, where nobody was using their meter and they just told you the price. And so I'm like, oh, I need to get to the train station to like the city center. And they're like, okay, it's going to be 15 kwai. I'm like, I'll just click the meter. And he's like, nope, we don't do that here in Fuding. And since then, I've been able to use like the Chinese Didi, the Chinese Uber app, and just hire a cab or whatever to circumvent this potentially getting a little taken advantage of as an outsider, because they do this to all outsiders, not just foreigners. So I get into fooding for the first time, and I'm totally underwhelmed because I thought fooding would be, tea central. And of course, there's a lot of tea houses, there's a lot of white tea branding, but there's nobody making white tea right there. There are no tea fields right around where I'm riding through. And really, I realized immediately, okay, to get into the tea fields, I have to get out into the tea mountains. And so I'm like, okay, I'll go to Diantou because I know Diantou has the wholesale market. And that's where they do a lot of this wholesale tea sales. But I don't want to get Diantou tea because, and I'll mention this here in a second, if you think Fuding is right on the coast, Diantou is right on the river inlet, right on the banks of the river, and really good position for exporting tea out into the harbor. It's on this nice little estuary, but the tea there is all grown right essentially on riverbanks. It's riverbank tea. And so it's not high mountain. Of course, we mentioned high mountain doesn't quite exist here, but still you could be higher than right on the riverbank. And so a lot of the tea from Diantou is good for export, it's good for wholesale, but it's not really the ideal tea. It's not the best tea that's being produced in Fuding. And so even though I plan to go to Diantou as a launching point, I don't want to buy Diantou tea. So I drop off my stuff at the hotel in Fuding, tiny place, and then I wave down a cab, tell him I want to go to Diantou, and he's like, all right, that's going to be 45 kwai. And I'm like, you're not going to use the meter? He's like, we don't do the meter. I'm like, got it. And so whatever, we drive out there, and then he drops me off, and he kind of asks me like, hey, like, do you have a plan to get back? And I'm like, yeah, I'll just grab another cab. He's like, okay. And he doesn't say anything else, but it seems like he wanted to give me his phone number in case I had trouble or in case I needed a ride out there. But I was confident in my abilities, which we'll see in the future was kind of a wrong call. And so now we've made it into our first Fuding tea village. This is Diantou. And let me give you a little overview of Diantou. Where in Fuding, I would see maybe one tea house out of every 10 stores on a street. Diantou is the opposite. Almost every place you see is a tea house, is a tea shop, is wholesaling tea. It's tea wholesale, tea wholesale, tea wholesale. Huge warehouse where they're storing all of their white tea. Wholesale, small restaurant. And so it's really crazy because this is not my first time doing this. A lot of times I go to these tea producing regions without any connections at all. And so all I know about the place I want to go to is where it is. And I go there and I just wander around lost until something really, really hits me. And so it might not be the most efficient use of my time. It's not the most efficient way to do this. I mean, if I only had 12 hours, I would do it differently. But if I have a week in a tea village, I'm going to take my time. I'm going to just wander around. I feel like a kid in a candy shop, like a dog, and you've just dumped 100 tennis balls in front of me, and I'm snapping at everyone, and I want everything. I want to try all the teas. I want to try all the tea houses. And it feels good. Like, I really like it. And eventually I have this strange kind of superstition, if you will, where I feel lucky and I can feel the synchronicity and I can feel this essentially like a flow state where I can connect with the right person. They have the right tea. But it actually reminds me of something I heard in a recent podcast about 4 types of luck. This all comes from a book published in the 70s by a neurologist, Dr. James Austin. He published the book Chase, Chance, and Creativity, The Lucky Art of Novelty. And here in this book, he says that there are 4 types of luck. The first one is blind luck. The second one is luck from motion. The third one is luck from awareness. And the fourth is luck from uniqueness. And so the way this happens is you don't just get lucky. Well, you do sometimes, and that's the first level. That's blind luck. Blind luck is you're sitting alone in your room and you get a phone call and something miraculous has just happened. It's sheer chance. You're not doing anything to manifest it, and it just comes to you. That's blind luck. The second one is luck from motion. Luck from motion is the idea that the more you move around, the more you travel, the more you look for anything, there are more chances of you getting hit with that lucky dart, hit with that lucky ball, just by the sheer chance that you're in more places than you were before. And so sometimes traveling, people get very lucky traveling and they meet the right people and they feel this synchronicity. But sometimes you can fine tune this even more, which gets into that third level of luck, which is luck from awareness. And this is, you've already mastered the first two levels and you're on the third level. So you're traveling around, you're moving a lot. Then you start seeing this idea that you get a feeling for something that's lucky is about to happen. You see something, you see a person, you connect with the right people, you fine tune your senses where this person will be good for me, that person will be good for me, this area is really good to be in at this time. And you start kind of manifesting your luck in that way. And that's primarily what I'm doing here, because the fourth level of luck, I don't think I've reached it, is the luck from uniqueness. And this is where you are essentially a magnet for luck. People come to you, chances come to you, and this kind of comes from fame or notoriety and having a name so that people know to look for you if they're doing something. And that could happen for me in tea, whereas somebody's like, oh, I have this really great idea for a tea podcast or something like that. Well, sorry, I've already done it, but but I could get, guests to come on and stuff like that because I'm starting to manifest this luck from uniqueness. So getting back to me being in Diantou and getting back to the Tao of my whole tea sourcing methods, where I don't know anyone in the village, I don't have any connections, I just get to the village blind and I walk around. And so I start that motion and then I keep looking for that idea of something lucky happening. One interesting thing about Diantou is that it's really not the best place for white tea. If you think about it geographically, Diantou is essentially a harbor, a port town, and so its land is not very high. It's a little marshy, a little boggy at times, and you don't have the best place for growing tea. However, Diantou is the hub for buying and selling, especially wholesale. This is where we have the white tea market in spring, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and autumn. This is where a lot of people, if they're from the mountains, they have a shop in Diantou. But if you ask somebody in Diantou if their farm is in Diantou, usually they'll tell you no. Usually they'll tell you it's from this area or this region or this region. Sometimes they're exaggerating. Sometimes it's not exactly true, but a lot of times it is, because think about if you have a tea garden in the rural mountains in a beautiful, pristine location, you're not going to just set up a lemonade stand in front of your mountain and hope that people drive an hour and a half up switchback roads to find you and buy your tea. You're going to find a place where people are going to buy tea and set up your shop there. And so a lot of the people in Diantou have really beautiful plots of land outside of Diantou. And so even though I went to Diantou looking for tea, I wasn't looking for Diantou tea. And so this kind of leads me into my story about the first person I met in Diantou and what I thought about him, what I thought about his tea, and kind of why I didn't want to initially buy from him before realizing that he had a plot of land outside of Diantou. And so what I did is I wandered around Diantou for a long time. I drank a lot of tea. I looked at their wholesale market. Again, this was 2019, so it was mid-April, so right around April 15th or something like that. There's the end of the Mudan harvest, and I go to where they're doing the wholesale market, and there's nothing there. And I'm like, is this the right place? And apparently it only happens in the evening, in the early morning. And then also this is kind of later in the seasons. Eventually I went back in 2021, right at the right time. And it was the most marvelous experience in the world. It was packed with people. There were hundreds and hundreds of people all shouting, moving tea around. What you do is people from the different regions without factories bring their tea to the Diantou whole leaf market, and then people with factories but without land come to the Diantou wholesale market and they buy the fresh leaf, and then they can rent these lots, these little like booths, and they essentially look like stables for horses or something like that. And you have lot 28B, and that's just a big, huge walled off kind of box. And you buy tea and they dump their tea in there. And then you pay it by the pound, by the gin, by the kilo. And so all the people are just lining up with their bags of tea from God knows where. And then people come by and they look at the tea, they smell it, they talk to the farmer, and then they say, hey, put it in lot number 28, and here's my ticket, I'll pay you however much it weighs. And so it's really cool just seeing the vibe, seeing the feeling, because it's so chaotic, and there's so many people all about this tea life. But it only happens for a few weeks out of the year, and as I mentioned, it happens in the morning, it happens in the evening. I have another story about when we went back in autumn and it was just totally dead, but there was still like, 2 rows of people. And so, after wandering around for a long time, sampling a lot of teas and really having that thick face, because what you have to do is you have to get into the tea house, drink tea, talk to the person, figure out if they're BSing you, figure out if their tea is actually good or not, figure out the prices, if the prices are fair, and figure out if they are the real deal, if they actually have the tea fields and the tea farms. And at some point, you realize, oh, I'm wasting my time. Oh, this is a false lead. And you have to extricate yourself from the situation after drinking hours and hours of tea with them. Or, after drinking some really nice silver needle and then realizing, like, oh, like, this is actually not your tea. You know farmers and you're buying tea from farmers. I want to find farmers. And so you have to have a lot of, in Chinese, they call it the thick face skin. And so you have to be really unashamed when you're like, okay, I need to leave. And they're like, no, please stay. Like, here's a snack. Here's a snack. Let's go eat dinner. And you just have to say, no, no, no. I really need to leave. And what you do is you just go next door. And I've gotten into trouble doing this so many times where I'll leave under an excuse, so I have to go back to my hotel. And I'll go into another tea house and I'll be drinking tea. And then the first owner of the first tea house walks in and he's like, oh, this guy's here too, huh? And I'm just like, oops, awkward. But it's all part of the life, because you can't marry the first tea farmer you find. You have to shop around. You have to really know if you're wasting your time, if this tea is good, and you have to be fair, because essentially, as I'm sourcing tea, I'm looking for the highest quality tea for everyone. I mean, for me, and then for all the people that support me and buy my tea and stuff. But at the same time, I really just want to find the best tea as well. And so you can't just buy tea off friendship alone. You have to actually find quality tea. And it's really amazing when the person with the best tea is also, the person with the best heart, and the person with the best story, and the person with the best land. And I really do feel like I lucked out here in Diantou, which I actually almost turned down the first time because I drank his tea. This is with Cho, who's my main guy, my main Panxi guy. But I've met him in Diantou. I didn't realize his farm was in Panxi, and so I meet him in Diantou. He's a really, really great guy, very wholesome, very kind, very animate, and just super, super passionate about the tea. He sits me down and he's just telling me all about tea history and like the shape of the leaf and how you can tell this, how you can tell that, if it was wild harvested, what kind of grade it is. And he's illustrating everything and I'm taking notes, and it's just like I spend 3-4 hours there, and the teas are all really good, the ones he's giving me. And then we go out to eat dinner. And then I'm just like kind of disappointed because I'm like, man, like this guy's tea is really good, but I want to find somebody with tea from a mountain in Panxi or Taimushan or something like that. And so eventually after dinner, I'm like, hey, like I need to leave. And Cho's like, oh, you could just stay here and we can take you back later. And I'm like, oh, it's okay. I'll find my own ride. And so I leave and I go to a few other tea houses, and there's nothing good there. There's not good tea. It's not the right type of people. It's not a right fit for me. And eventually I'm like, okay, it's getting dark. I need to get back to Fuding, and I look for a cab on the app. And I wait, and I wait, and I wait, and then the look that the cab driver gave me when he dropped me off in the morning comes back to my mind, and I'm like, oh, he knew there weren't going to be any cabs. And then I'm thinking of Cho saying like, oh, are you sure you have a ride back? Because we could take you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, and I look for another way. I look for a bus route. I look for even hitchhiking, because I want to save at least some modicum of face. And then eventually I can't do it, and I just go back to Cho, and I'm like, hey, funny this. I can't get back to Fuding. Could you give me a ride? And so he gives me a ride when they close down. And in the car, I overhear them talking about their Panxi garden. And I was like, wait, you guys have a Panxi garden? They're like, yeah, that's where we do all our tea. And I'm like, oh, I never asked. I just assumed they were Diantou natives. But no, Cho was a Fuzhou native and his wife was a Diantou native. But the land they lease is out in Panxi. And so I quickly make arrangements for them to go out to Panxi the next day with Cho. And Cho is very gracious about it, and he's very excited. And he's got this very energetic spirit and really wants to spread white tea culture and Fuding tea culture. And so he gets very excited about it. And so I make a plan to go out to Fuding the next day with him. So Cho actually lives in Fuding City and then commutes out to Diantou every day. And so my hotel was in Fuding City, so he picked me right up. He told me not to eat breakfast because he was going to treat me to a breakfast in Panxi. And, I'm very excited to sample the local cuisine, the local foods, specialties, and whatnot. And so after driving 30, 40 minutes out through the mountains and stuff, again, the mental map here is Fuding City is in the north, and then you go south to Diantou. If you keep going south, you hit Taimushan, but then if you go southwest from Diantou, you'll hit Panxi. And so once we get into Panxi, we get stop at this traditional place and get the nice breakfast, a simple bowl with what looks like dumplings in it. And it's like a soup dumpling kind of situation. But the dumplings are just like pure, what feels to me like pure meat. And it's called this royan. And royan apparently is minced pork mixed with sweet potato flour. And so the sweet potato flour kind of turns it into this own kind of meat dumpling. Sometimes you have like a flour skin on top of it. Other times it's just the meat itself. And it's a super simple dish, but it is also just like a pure meat. It's like a soup just with a bunch of meat in it. And so I eat it and it tastes good, but eventually when I'm in Fuding, everyone wants to eat this almost all the time. And for me, it's just meat. There's no vegetables. There's nothing else to it. And so it's kind of boring. I don't really like it. Anyways, after that, we buy some fruit and we go up to the mountain on Panxi. What we first do is we stop at his factory, and he gives me the whole tour of his factory. We see the tea being dried outside. He takes me inside and shows me the second grade of tea that's made with cool air. And so essentially, the tea outside are placed on essentially what looks like, screens, like window screens or something like that, elevated at a 45-degree angle so that wind can hit it from both sides. It's a nice sunny day, so the sun's coming in over the top of it. But you do have to watch it because he says you have to make sure it doesn't get too hot. You make sure the water content doesn't lower too fast. And ideally, it should take about 48 hours, 2 days, for it to kind of this sun dry and wither down. So without getting too far into the processing of white tea, because I'll do a whole episode on that, the idea here is to get after picking, to sun wither it, and this is the formative kill the green phase, is equivalent to other types of tea production. But what you want to do is you want to bring the leaf from 100% moisture content down to something like 15%. And then after this 48-hour period, which is the most crucial because that's when all flavors can develop if you're doing it wrong, if the temperature of the leaf is too hot, if it withers too fast, if it withers too slow. After that, then you have that drying phase, because at this point the tea is very, very light and the wind can just blow it all away if it's just sitting on screens outside. And so the later phase, the drying phase, usually happens indoor with either hot air or lukewarm air. But anyways, Cho shows me his factory, and it's really nice. It's really clean. And what Cho is doing is he has a lot of tea experts working for him, a lot of tea masters, like one guy who's just in charge of the withering process, one person who's in charge of the drying process, one person who's in charge of the yang cha, which is this kind of homogenizing the different piles of different teas from different harvests so that they can be pressed into cakes together. And this is one thing I've learned about Cho is like, he's not necessarily a born and bred farmer. He has this incredible story, which I'll get into later, about how he got into the tea world. But what he is he's just a passionate tea lover, and he's doing everything right. He's leasing the best land, he's hiring the right people, he's building the best factories for it. And he just has this deep passion for tea that I haven't really seen in a lot of other places, because a lot of times I'm dealing with the smaller farmers that they live on the land, they understand how to pick and how to grow and how to make the tea, but they don't understand the higher levels of it. And this gets into what we talked about in the first episode about Ming Dynasty tea snobbery. Like, only those of the higher class can really appreciate tea. Though at the same time, Cho looks at it from a different perspective than a lot of the farmers making tea. Anyways, after we tour his factory, he takes me up to his garden and he leases this land. And so, as I've mentioned, he started his tea company back in 2013 after he came back from working abroad. And he just bought a bunch of properties, leased a bunch of land, and has been essentially having them grow tea. I think he has a little bit of wild land there as well, which is just a few gardens that he has not let them prune and let the trees grow wild. And so his wild tea is not truly wild tea. It's still a Dabaihao varietal, planted in a garden, but let grown naturally for, almost a decade. And so Cho takes me up to his garden. It's really relatively high up. It's like 600 meters. Looks beautiful. It's all interdispersed with forests and tea fields and forests and tea fields. And Cho's one of the guys who really talks about how much he loves the government regulations, because the government regulations say you can't cut down forests and plant new tea gardens. And this prevents the flooding of the market. This prevents the monoculture of tea production that we see down south in Anxi, and keeps Fuding. It kind of protects Fuding White Tea. It's making it future proof. And so on the way up to the garden, we see a few interesting things. One is that there are huge cement blocks blocking off certain passages into the tea fields, into the tea mountains. And so you can't take big cars up there. You can't take big trucks up there. You can barely squeeze through with a small van or small minivan. And I ask what that's about, and he says it's to prevent people hiring pesticide trucks coming up and spraying the fields. And it's just a really interesting thing to see this like analog way to prevent it from happening, because you have so many things. You have the legislations, you have, a reward for people reporting other people for using pesticides. And then you also have these crazy blocks on the road. And eventually the roads are so bad that we have to park the car and walk up. And Cho demonstrates the different types of picking for me, the Huangpian, the Mudan, the different levels of the Mudan. And Cho's just really having a good time picking by himself, playing the tea farmer. But all in all, I'm very impressed. I mean, I even see a sign that says the Yuanming Garden, which is his tea company name. And so he didn't just take me out to a random field. He's talking to the makers as he was in the factory, asking about production of the day, asking about how much they're picking, asking about the pick quality and the pick grades. Have you eaten lunch and stuff like that? And so it's really nice to see his connection with the whole process. It's something that he's obviously very, very attuned to, even if he's not the one fertilizing or pruning or picking and stuff like that. He's aware of every element of the process. And that's something I noticed in the tea house when he tells me all about the different types of tea, how to judge the highest quality, how to figure out the grades of the teas, how to tell if it's wild pick or garden grown. And it's really cool because in the garden, he's also demonstrating the different ways. Like, this is why you see the ma teas, the horse hoof pick on the tea leaves. It's because they're pulling it off like this instead of picking it directly. And so later when I organized a tea trip into Fuding with some friends, I wanted Cho to be the guy. But that week that we had planned, Cho got really sick. And so he invited his friend Zhang to show me his garden. And Zhang is the guy I'll talk about in the next episode, because he has the wild, or not, he does have some wild. He has some wild Taimushan gardens and some gardens in Bailing. And his factory is in Bailing. And so we'll go there next time, but right now I want to stick to Cho in Panxi. So all in all, I'm super impressed with the quality, his understanding, the cleanliness of his factory, the precision of his work, and it really comes across in his tea and in what he's doing. And so a lot of what One River Tea does is working with small farms, small farmers, people who have been marginalized, and trying to figure out how we can improve their hold on the domestic market and the international market. But with this white tea, with Cho and his white tea, the tea is just too good to pass up. And Cho is a wholehearted man. And so for me, I'm okay, because Cho, he doesn't need to sell me tea to make a living. And so he is selling me tea because he likes me, because we can both appreciate tea, and he knows I'm sharing it with the rest of the world. And so I know that Cho is giving me very high quality tea at very fair prices because he's just passionate about making high quality Fuding White Tea. And so it's really interesting because he's very different from a lot of the other farmers we work with, because he is not even necessarily a farmer. He's more of a curator, more of one who delegates the work to other, great masters and people that know their job and know this job and know that job. And I remember drinking tea with Cho after this. He takes me back to his Diantou, and he shows me his showroom where he stores all of his favorite tea, and it's like under lock and security camera, and he opens it up, and the room inside is just perfectly, it's essentially hermetic, like with the dehumidifiers, with the AC, with the fans. It's all wooden boards, and underneath the wooden boards is a layer of charcoal, and so he's maintaining this essentially tea vault, and within that vault he has boxes and boxes of 30 kg of wild silver needle from 2015, from 2013, from 2012. And he gives an estimate of how much tea, the worth of the product in this small room. And I think it's like 3 million kwai, which is something like 40, 50, 500,000 US dollars or something like that of just tea in this tiny room. And he takes out one of his nicest teas and he says, this is, some 2011 silver needle. And he brews it up for me, and it's just like just a divine experience. And what's really great about this is I start asking like how he got into tea, and he has the most wild story about this. And so we're drinking tea in his showroom, him and his wife, and one of his workers, and I'm asking them the story, and he tells me that for 16 years he worked in America in a restaurant. And I'm like, that's strange, because he's never really spoken any English to me. And I ask him, do you know any English? He says, no, I don't. And I'm like, how did you spend 16 years in America without learning any English? And he says, it was part of this whole package where he grew up a young boy in Fuzhou City with, not a lot of means. And he fell in love with this girl in Diantou, which is his wife. And, part of the Chinese culture is you need to buy a house, you need to buy a car, you need to essentially have a little bit of wealth before you can get married. And so he essentially pledges himself to her and then goes to America to make his living. And it's all-inclusive thing. And he's just saving up, sending all the money he makes back to China. He has enough money to make one phone call every month to his wife, which he does, his fiance. And what's really amazing about this story is like she's right there, and like, I can see how moved she is by him telling me the story, and I'm just like, this is totally bizarre. So after 16 years of this, of calling his fiance once a month and working all the time, not even going out, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke. What he likes to do is he likes to fish, and so that was his only kind of leisure there. But then after 16 years, he comes back to Fujian, buys a bunch of properties, buys a tea company, starts his own tea company, starts leasing land. And in 2013, that's when he really starts getting into it. And it's just really, really remarkable. Just that dedication. 16 years where you don't even go out, you don't learn any of the language, you don't travel, you just go fishing and you call your fiance, your sweetheart once every month. Absolutely bizarre, absolutely incredible. And again, they're just such a wholesome group. I love being around them, I love being with them and listening to their stories and listening to their passion about tea and how Cho explains the tea to me. And so for me, I definitely feel like I got lucky here. For Cho, his Panxi garden, meeting him in Diantou, and I think he is part of the big reason that we have such good white tea. And again, he's introduced me to Zhang, who's pressed some tea cakes, and I'll mention Zhang in the next episode. This episode got a little long. I guess I have a lot to say about these people, these villages, and the style of tea they're making. So hopefully next episode I'll take it a little slower, talk about Zhang and Taimoshan and Bailing. And really, I can also talk about Zhu, who does the wild tea farm. He's the one up by the Lushuiya organic tea zone. But again, thank you guys so much for joining into this episode. We're going to continue this talk about Fuding White Tea in the next episode. So, this is Derek from Wonder Tea. Until next time, brew happy.